I showed up to my father's retirement party wearing my best dress, clutching an invitation that might as well have been a rejection letter. The Riverside Community Center looked exactly like I remembered from every family gathering. Beige walls decorated with faded motivational posters, and that persistent smell of industrial coffee that no amount of air freshener could mask. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The volunteer at the check-in table squinted at her clipboard like she was decoding ancient hieroglyphics. Sorry, honey, I don't see a Jessica Martinez on the family list. I handed her my invitation, the one my mother had forwarded via email with the subject line, Dad's Party, please dress appropriately. She examined it like I'd handed her a counterfeit $20 bill. This says general admissions, sweetie. Family seating is reserved. Right then, I watched them walk through the main entrance like they owned the place. My father Bob strutted in wearing his best suit, the navy one he only brought out for weddings and court appearances. My mother Linda was at his side, clutching her purse with both hands like someone might snatch it, dressed like she was attending a country club luncheon instead of a retirement party at a community center. Behind them came my brother Dave, his wife Amy practically glowing with that satisfied smile she wore whenever she felt important. They sailed past the check-in table without stopping, past me standing there like lobby furniture, straight toward the reserved family section up front. Dave caught sight of me and smirked, not even slowing down. Having trouble getting in, Jess? Guess they're being selective tonight. Amy giggled like he'd just delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke. The volunteer shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the family drama brewing in her check-in line. I can call someone from the Martinez party, she offered, though her tone suggested she'd rather do literally anything else. Don't worry about it, I said, forcing a smile. I'll figure it out. I stepped aside and watched my family claim their spots at the head table, right underneath a banner that read, Celebrating 25 Years, Martinez Construction. The whole setup looked like a small-town political rally, complete with balloons, catered finger foods, and enough folding chairs to seat half of Riverside. Dave was already working the room, shaking hands and accepting congratulations like he'd personally hammered every nail in every house my father had ever built. Mom was busy arranging gift bags and smoothing tablecloths, playing the perfect hostess role she'd perfected over decades of being married to a small business owner. Dad stood near the makeshift stage, nodding at compliments and slapping backs with the authority of a man who'd spent 25 years telling other people how to swing a hammer. None of this surprised me, honestly. I'd received the invitation 3 days before the event, forwarded from Mom with no personal note, no phone call, just a digital afterthought with parking instructions and a reminder about appropriate attire. In the Martinez family, appropriate attire meant quiet, presentable, and invisible, unless specifically needed for photos. I could have made a scene right there. Could have mentioned that I'd driven 2 hours from Los Angeles specifically for this party, that I'd rearranged client meetings and canceled dinner plans. Could have reminded everyone that I was Bob Martinez's daughter too, not just some random person who wandered in off the street. But that wasn't the point tonight. So I found an empty chair near the back, close enough to hear the speeches but far enough away to avoid the family dynamics that had been playing on repeat for 30 years. From my spot, I had a perfect view of the head table, where Dave was already practicing his heir-apparent routine, probably rehearsing the speech where he'd talk about carrying on the family legacy. The community center filled up quickly. Contractors, clients, suppliers, neighbors, all of them eager to pay their respects to Bob Martinez, the guy who'd built half the renovations in Riverside County. I recognized most of the faces from years of family barbecues and Christmas parties, back when I still got invited to those things. Mrs. Henderson from down the street waved at me from across the room, confusion flickering across her face like she couldn't quite place me in this context. Old man Rodriguez, who used to hire Dad for small jobs when I was a kid, nodded in my direction but didn't approach. They all knew me as Bob's younger daughter, the one who'd moved away and worked in something vague involving apartments. Dave had taken the microphone and was testing it with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged on stage. Mom was beaming at him with the kind of pride usually reserved for Nobel Prize winners or Olympic athletes. Dad was checking his watch, probably calculating how long he had to endure compliments before he could get to the bar. And me? I was sitting in the back row like an invited stranger, watching my family celebrate a legacy I'd apparently never been part of. The daughter who'd moved to Los Angeles and did something involving rental properties, something they'd never quite understood or bothered to ask about in detail. A server approached my table with a basket of dinner rolls and a smile that suggested she felt sorry for the woman sitting alone. I took a roll I didn't want and smiled back, settling in for what promised to be a very long evening of being professionally invisible at my own father's retirement party. The retirement party officially kicked off with Dave tapping the microphone 3 times, producing that feedback screech that made everyone in the room wince simultaneously. He grinned like he'd just accomplished something impressive instead of nearly deafening 50 people with amateur audio equipment. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to celebrating my dad, Bob Martinez, and 25 years of building dreams in Riverside County. The applause was immediate and genuine, the kind you get when people actually respect the person being honored. Dave waited for it to die down, clearly enjoying his moment at center stage. I watched from my back row seat as Dad's face lit up with the kind of pride that comes from watching your chosen successor handle the spotlight. Mom was practically vibrating with excitement, her hands clasped together like she was watching Dave accept an Academy Award. This was their moment, their validation that they'd raised the right kid to carry forward the Martinez name. Dave launched into a speech that sounded like he'd been practicing it for weeks. My father didn't just build houses, he built homes. He didn't just renovate kitchens, he renovated lives. Every project was a partnership. Every client became family. The crowd ate it up, nodding along as Dave painted a picture of Bob Martinez as some kind of construction saint who'd single-handedly improved the quality of life for everyone in Riverside. And honestly, a lot of it was true. Dad had built a solid reputation over the years, one honest job at a time. He'd started with nothing but a truck, a toolbox, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from growing up with calloused hands and an empty bank account. By the time he was 40, Martinez Construction was the name people called when they wanted quality work, without the big company markup. The slideshow started rolling on a projector screen that looked like it had been borrowed from a middle school classroom. Photo after photo of construction sites, before and after shots, Dad posing with satisfied clients in front of newly renovated homes. There was the Henderson kitchen remodel from 2015, the Rodriguez bathroom renovation that took 3 months because Mrs. Rodriguez changed her mind about tile colors 4 different times. Each photo came with commentary from Dave, little stories about problem solving and customer service that made Dad look like a combination of Bob Vila and Mother Teresa. The crowd chuckled at the appropriate moments, applauded when Dave paused for effect, and generally played their part in the Bob Martinez Appreciation Society meeting. From my spot in the back, I could see the whole production clearly. The way Mom kept checking her phone to make sure she was getting good photos of Dave's speech. The way Dad nodded along, occasionally chiming in with corrections or additional details. The way Amy videotaped everything like she was documenting a historical event for future generations. This was the Martinez legacy in action. Dad the builder, Dave the successor, Mom the supportive foundation, Amy the devoted wife who'd produce the next generation of Martinez construction workers. A neat, tidy family business story with clearly defined roles and a predetermined ending. The problem was that I'd never fit into any of those roles, and nobody had ever bothered to create a new one for me. When I graduated high school, Dad had assumed I'd go to community college, maybe study business or accounting, something practical that could help with the company books. When I told him I was moving to Los Angeles to study property management, he shrugged and said real estate was a decent backup plan for women who couldn't handle construction work. When Dave graduated, there was a party. When I graduated, there was a card with $50 and a note about being careful in the big city. When Dave got his first project management job with the company, Dad took him out for steaks and beer. When I got my property management license, Mom asked if that meant I'd be working in an office now, like with air conditioning and everything. The slideshow kept rolling, 25 years of Martinez construction history condensed into 10 minutes of carefully curated success stories. There was Dave as a teenager, wearing a hard hat that was too big for his head, pretending to help with a bathroom renovation. There was the company Christmas party from 2018, all the employees gathered around Dad, like he was some kind of construction industry celebrity. There wasn't a single photo of me. Not one picture of the daughter who'd spent summer vacations cleaning up job sites, who'd learned to read blueprints before she could read chapter books, who'd memorized the difference between Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers by age 10. I'd been around for plenty of those projects, had even helped with some of them, but apparently my contributions hadn't been worth documenting. Dave was wrapping up his introduction, building toward the moment when Dad would take the microphone and deliver his own retirement speech. The crowd was primed for it, ready to give Bob Martinez the send-off he deserved after a quarter-century of honest work and fair dealing. I noticed Sarah Chen slip in through the side door, scanning the room like she was looking for someone specific. Sarah was a real estate broker I'd worked with on several deals over the years, one of the few people in Riverside who actually knew what I did for a living. She caught sight of me and raised her hand in a small wave, but I shook my head slightly. Not yet. The truth was, I hadn't told anyone in my family that Sarah would be here tonight. Hadn't mentioned that she'd specifically asked for the date and location of Dad's retirement party. Hadn't explained why one of the most successful brokers in Riverside County would want to attend a construction worker's retirement celebration. There were a lot of things I hadn't mentioned to my family over the years. Dave finished his speech to enthusiastic applause and gestured toward Dad with the kind of theatrical flourish usually reserved for game show hosts. The crowd rose to their feet as Bob Martinez walked toward the microphone, clearly emotional, but trying to maintain his composure. This was his moment, the capstone of a career built on sweat equity and customer satisfaction. Dad took the microphone and looked out over the crowd, his voice slightly rough with emotion. When I started this company, I had a truck, a toolbox, and a pregnant wife who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. The crowd chuckled, and Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd apparently been saving for this exact moment. He talked about the early days, sleeping in the truck between jobs to save money on gas, learning to estimate materials by eye, because he couldn't afford to overorder and eat the cost. He talked about building relationships with suppliers, earning trust one project at a time, slowly growing from a one-man operation to a company that employed 6 full-time workers and dozens of subcontractors. It was a good speech, honest and heartfelt, the kind of thing that made you believe in small business and American dreams. Dad thanked his employees, his customers, his suppliers, everyone who'd helped make Martinez Construction what it had become. He thanked Mom for keeping the books and handling the phone calls and putting up with him coming home covered in sawdust and paint. He thanked Dave for carrying on the family tradition, for bringing new ideas and fresh energy to the company, for making sure that Martinez Construction would outlive its founder. The applause for that was particularly loud, especially from the family table where Amy was recording every word on her phone. Then Dad paused, scanning the crowd like he was making sure he hadn't forgotten anyone important. His eyes passed over my section of the room without stopping, without acknowledgement, without any indication that his younger daughter was present for this milestone moment. And that was when I realized that this entire evening was about celebrating not just Dad's career, but the version of the Martinez family story that didn't include me. The narrative where Bob built a company, raised a son to take it over, and lived happily ever after. The story where Jessica Martinez was a footnote, the daughter who'd moved away and never really contributed to the family legacy. The retirement party continued around me, warm and celebratory and completely convinced of its own version of the truth. Dad finished his speech to thunderous applause. People began lining up to congratulate him personally, and the evening settled into that comfortable rhythm of good food and old stories. I stayed in my seat, watching my family accept congratulations like they'd just won some kind of award for excellence in father-son business partnerships. Sarah Chen was still standing near the side door, checking her watch occasionally but clearly waiting for something. What she was waiting for, what I was waiting for, what nobody else in that room expected, was about to change everything they thought they knew about the Martinez family story. The congratulations line stretched halfway across the community center, a parade of weathered hands and genuine smiles as people waited to shake Dad's hand and share their own Bob Martinez stories. I watched contractors tell him about projects from 15 years ago. Homeowners thank him for bathrooms that still looked perfect after a decade. Suppliers reminisce about handshake deals that had grown into lasting partnerships. Dave positioned himself right next to Dad, naturally assuming his role as the crown prince of Martinez Construction. Every person who congratulated Dad automatically turned to Dave next, offering their own version of "you must be so proud to be taking over the family business." Dave soaked up each comment like he'd been training for this moment his entire life, which in many ways, he had. The thing about being the chosen one is that you never have to question whether you belong. Dave had grown up knowing that Martinez Construction would be his someday, had spent his childhood drawing blueprints on napkins and playing with toy bulldozers while other kids played video games. When he turned 16, Dad bought him his own tool belt. When he graduated high school, there was already a job waiting for him at the company. I remember the exact moment I realized I wasn't part of that plan. I was 14, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while Dad and Dave discussed a bathroom renovation they were planning. Dave was 17 then, already working part-time jobs after school, already talking about construction techniques, like he'd been born understanding the difference between load-bearing walls and decorative ones. Dad was explaining how they'd need to reroute the plumbing, sketching rough diagrams on the back of an envelope, while Dave asked intelligent questions about pipe angles and water pressure. I looked up from my algebra homework and asked if I could help with the project, maybe learn something about plumbing or tile work. Dad glanced at me with the kind of patient smile you give a child who's asked to help perform brain surgery. "That's sweet, honey, but this kind of work isn't really for girls. You'd get your clothes dirty, and Linda would kill me if I brought you home covered in grout." Dave had snorted, not meanly, just with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never questioned his own place in the world. Besides, Dad had continued, "You're good at school stuff, numbers and paperwork and organizing things. That's valuable too. Maybe someday you can help keep the books for the business, answer phones, that kind of thing." That was my role in the Martinez Construction empire. Future receptionist. While Dave spent weekends learning to use power tools and studying building codes, I was encouraged to focus on my grades and maybe take a typing class. While Dad took Dave to hardware stores and taught him how to estimate materials, I was told that girls were naturally better at organizing and customer service. While Dave's future was being carved in stone, mine was being written in disappearing ink. The pattern continued through high school. Dave's report cards were occasions for celebration, not because his grades were particularly impressive, but because he was balancing school with real-world experience at the job sites. My straight A's were acknowledged with a pat on the head and a reminder that I was smart enough to do whatever I wanted, as long as it didn't interfere with being a good wife and mother someday. When college discussions started, the difference became even more obvious. Dave was encouraged to study business management, maybe take some engineering courses, anything that would make him a better leader for the family company. I was steered toward education, or nursing, something practical that would provide stable income until I got married and had kids. The assumption was never stated outright, but it hung over every conversation like smoke from a barbecue grill. Dave was the legacy. I was the placeholder. Even now, watching him work the retirement party crowd, with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the family hierarchy, I could see how thoroughly he'd internalized his role as the heir apparent. He wasn't arrogant about it. Exactly. He just moved through the world with the unshakable certainty that doors would open for him, that people would take him seriously, that his opinions mattered by virtue of his last name and his gender. Amy had positioned herself near the gift table, graciously accepting congratulations on her husband's bright future and making small talk about their plans for expanding the business. She played the supportive wife role perfectly, deflecting praise back to Dave, while subtly reminding everyone that she was married to the future owner of Martinez Construction. I'd always found Amy's transformation fascinating, in a depressing sort of way. When Dave first brought her home during their junior year of college, she'd been studying accounting and talking about maybe getting her CPA license someday. Now she organized charity drives for the company and planned employee family picnics, having somehow morphed into the perfect contractor's wife without anyone noticing when she'd stopped having her own ambitions. Mom was in her element too, playing hostess and family matriarch with the kind of grace that comes from 30 years of practice. She guided conversations, introduced people who hadn't met, and made sure everyone felt welcome at her husband's celebration. This was her night too, the culmination of decades spent supporting Dad's dream and raising the son who would carry it forward. Frank, Martinez, Dad's older brother and the closest thing the family had to a wise elder statesman, held court near the dessert table with stories about the early days when Bob was just a punk kid with more ambition than sense. Frank had worked construction for 40 years before retiring to Phoenix, and his presence added weight to the evening's theme of honoring working-class legacy and family tradition. Everyone had a role tonight. Everyone had a place in the Martinez story being celebrated. Everyone except me. I wasn't bitter about it anymore, at least not in the way I used to be. You can only bang your head against the same wall for so long before you realize the wall isn't going to move. Instead, I'd learned to find my own path, to build my own success, to create my own version of what the Martinez work ethic could accomplish. The irony was that I'd taken everything Dad had taught me about hard work and customer service and applied it to an industry he'd never bothered to understand. While Dave was learning to hang drywall and install fixtures, I was learning about property values and rental markets. While he was building other people's dream homes, I was building my own real estate portfolio. But none of that mattered tonight, at least not to anyone at the head table. Tonight was about celebrating the official version of the Martinez success story, the one where Bob built a construction company, and Dave inherited it, and everyone lived happily ever after within a 10-mile radius of where they'd been born. Sarah Chen was still waiting by the side door, occasionally checking her phone but clearly in no hurry to leave. A few people had nodded at her, probably recognizing her from real estate transactions over the years, but nobody had approached her directly. In Riverside's small business community, everyone knew everyone, but they also knew when to mind their own business. The dinner service was winding down, paper plates stacked high with the remains of catered Mexican food and store-bought sheet cake. Dad had settled into a chair at the head table, still accepting congratulations but looking tired in the way that comes after emotional highs. Dave was circulating through the crowd, collecting business cards and making connections that would serve him well as the new face of Martinez Construction. Uncle Frank made his way over to where I was sitting, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he was about to dispense unsolicited wisdom. "Mind if I sit down, Jessica? This chair taken by anyone important?" I gestured to the empty seat beside me. "All yours, Uncle Frank." He settled in with the careful movements of someone whose joints had endured decades of physical labor, then handed me one of the coffee cups. "Your dad's having quite a night," he said, sipping his coffee and surveying the party with satisfaction. "Worked his whole life for this moment, watching his boy take over the family business. Makes a man feel like he accomplished something permanent, you know?" I nodded. Because what else was I supposed to do? Frank meant well, always had. He was just operating from the same playbook as everyone else in the family, the one where Dave's success was automatically the family's success, and my absence from the construction business was simply the natural order of things. Frank continued, oblivious to any underlying tension. "Your brother's got a good head on his shoulders, knows the business inside and out. Bob trained him right. And that Amy's a keeper too, perfect wife for a contractor. They'll do well together." He paused to wave at someone across the room, then turned back to me with the kind of expression that suggested he was about to offer profound insight. "Course not everyone's cut out for construction work. Takes a special kind of person to build things with their hands, deal with the stress and the physical demands. Your dad always said you were the smart one in the family, better suited for indoor work." There it was again, the assumption that had followed me since childhood. Jessica was too delicate for real work, too cerebral for practical applications, too feminine for the masculine world of construction. Better to keep her safely tucked away in some office somewhere, filing papers and answering phones, while the men handled the important business of building things. Frank's intentions were good, but his perspective was limited by the same narrow definition of success that had shaped 3 generations of Martinez men. In his world, working with your hands was noble, owning land was the ultimate goal, and anything that happened in an office was somehow less substantial than anything that happened on a job site. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd taken their values and applied them in ways they'd never imagined. I'd built something too, just not with hammers and nails. Uncle Frank excused himself to get another slice of cake, leaving me alone with my lukewarm coffee and a growing collection of memories I usually tried to keep buried. The laughter and conversation around me faded into background noise as my mind drifted back to all the moments that had led to this one. Sitting alone at my father's retirement party like an uninvited guest at my own family's celebration. The pattern had started early, so early that I used to think it was normal. When I was 8 years old, Dad took Dave to his first real job site, a kitchen renovation for the Hendersons down the street. Dave was 11 then, old enough to carry tools and hand Dad screws when he needed them. I begged to come along, promised I'd be helpful and quiet and wouldn't get in the way. Dad had ruffled my hair and told me job sites were dangerous places for little girls. Too much heavy equipment and sharp objects. Besides, Mom needed help organizing the office paperwork, sorting invoices and filing receipts. That would be much more useful, he'd said, and much safer for someone my size. I'd spent that Saturday afternoon in the makeshift office Mom had set up in our spare bedroom, separating carbon copies and stuffing them into manila folders, while listening to Dave's excited chatter when he and Dad came home for lunch. He couldn't stop talking about using a real drill, about learning to measure twice and cut once, about Dad teaching him the difference between drywall screws and wood screws. When I asked if I could try using the drill sometime, Dad had smiled and said maybe when I was older, maybe when I was big enough to handle the responsibility. But Dave was only 3 years older than me, and he'd seemed plenty responsible enough to handle power tools. The next weekend, the same thing happened. Dad and Dave disappeared to another job site while I stayed home with Mom, learning to answer the business phone with the proper greeting and take messages in neat handwriting. The weekend after that, I wasn't even asked if I wanted to help with office work. It was simply assumed that my natural place was inside, away from the real action. By the time I was 12, the division of labor in our household was set in stone. Dave worked alongside Dad every weekend and most afternoons after school, learning the trade from the ground up and earning pocket money for his contributions. I babysat neighbors' kids and helped Mom with grocery shopping and meal planning, developing what they called valuable life skills for my future role as a wife and mother. When Dave turned 16 and got his driver's license, Dad bought him a used pickup truck so he could haul materials and drive himself to job sites. When I turned 16, I got a part-time job at the local library, filing books and helping patrons find the romance novels. Dad said it was perfect for me, clean and quiet and educational, the kind of work that would look good on college applications. The library job actually turned out to be one of the best things that happened to me during high school, though not for the reasons my parents expected. Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, had worked in real estate before switching careers, and she used to tell me stories about property development and investment strategies during slow afternoons. She'd explain how successful investors found undervalued properties, improved them, and either sold them for profit or held them as rental income. I became fascinated by the idea that you could make money not just from building things, but from owning them. Mrs. Patterson lent me books about real estate investing, residential property management, and commercial development. I read about people who'd started with nothing and built empires by understanding markets and recognizing opportunities that others missed. When I mentioned this new interest at dinner one night, suggesting that real estate might be a good complement to Dad's construction business, the response was politely dismissive. Dad explained that real estate agents were basically salespeople who got lucky when other people did the actual work of building and renovating. The real value, he said, was in the labor and craftsmanship, not in shuffling paperwork and collecting commissions. Dave had chimed in with his own opinion, fresh from a conversation with one of Dad's subcontractors who'd complained about dealing with real estate agents on a recent project. They're all about quick sales and fast money, Dave had said. They don't understand what it takes to actually build something lasting. Mom had nodded along, adding that real estate seemed like a very competitive field, probably too stressful for someone with my personality. Wouldn't I be happier doing something more stable? Something that didn't require aggressive sales tactics and constant networking. The message was clear, even if it wasn't stated directly. Real estate was flashy and superficial, while construction was solid and respectable. Dave's path led toward something meaningful and permanent, while my interests were pointing toward something frivolous and temporary. During my senior year of high school, the differences in how Dave and I were treated became impossible to ignore. When Dave announced that he wanted to study business management in college so he could eventually take over Martinez Construction, there was a family celebration. Dad opened a bottle of champagne, Mom called her sister with the good news, and Uncle Frank drove down from Bakersfield specifically to congratulate his nephew on choosing such a practical career path. When I announced that I wanted to study property management and real estate development, the reaction was much more muted. Dad said it sounded interesting, in the same tone he might use to discuss someone's hobby collecting stamps. Mom worried that it would be too demanding, too male-dominated, too uncertain for someone who might want to start a family someday. The guidance counselor at school had been more encouraging, helping me research programs and scholarship opportunities. But at home, my college plans were treated as a phase I'd grow out of, a detour I'd take before settling into something more appropriate for a Martinez daughter. The night before I left for Los Angeles to start my property management program, Dad had pulled me aside for what he probably thought was a heart-to-heart conversation. He told me he was proud of me for wanting to get an education, that college would be good for me even if I didn't end up using the degree professionally. The important thing, he'd said, was that I'd have something to fall back on if life didn't work out the way I planned. Fall back on. Like my education was insurance against failure rather than preparation for success. Dave's send-off to business school had been completely different. Dad had given him a speech about representing the family name, about learning everything he could so he'd be ready to take Martinez construction to the next level. There were expectations and responsibilities and a clear timeline for Dave's return to Riverside as the heir apparent. My departure had felt more like a temporary leave of absence than the beginning of my adult career. The pattern continued even after I graduated and started working in property management. When I called home to share news about getting my real estate license, Mom had asked if that meant I'd be showing houses to people, like on those TV shows. When I explained that I was working with commercial properties and learning about investment strategies, Dad had suggested that I might want to consider coming home soon, before I got too comfortable living so far from family. Dave's progress through business school and his summer internships with local contractors were regular topics of conversation at family gatherings. Everyone wanted to hear about his classes, his professors, his plans for modernizing Martinez construction. My work in Los Angeles was usually summarized as Jessica's doing well in the big city, managing apartments for some company. The real irony was that I'd been absorbing lessons about hard work and customer service and building something permanent since childhood, just not in the way my family expected. Every summer I'd spent filing invoices had taught me about cash flow and accounts receivable. Every conversation I'd overheard about difficult clients had shown me the importance of clear communication and managing expectations. Every weekend, I'd watched Dad solve problems on job sites, had demonstrated the value of creative thinking and persistence. I'd taken all of those lessons and applied them to real estate, building relationships with property owners and tenants, learning to spot opportunities that others missed, slowly developing the expertise and connections that would eventually allow me to start investing on my own. But because my work didn't involve tool belts and pickup trucks, it somehow didn't count as carrying on the Martinez family tradition. The retirement party continued around me, a celebration of everything Dad had built and Dave would inherit. Looking around the room, I could see 3 generations of the same mindset, the same assumptions about who belonged in construction and who didn't, the same certainty that some kinds of work mattered more than others. Sarah Chen was still waiting by the side door, patient but alert, like someone who knew exactly what she was waiting for. In a few hours, these same people who were toasting Dad's legacy and Dave's future would learn something that might change their understanding of what success looked like, what building something lasting actually meant, and which Martinez child had really been paying attention to the family business lessons all along. But for now, I was content to sit in the back row and watch them enjoy their version of the story, the one where everything made sense and everyone knew their place, and the future was as predictable as a well-built foundation. The evening was winding down when Mom approached my table, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd been avoiding a conversation all night but finally couldn't postpone it any longer. She carried 2 cups of coffee and wore the expression she used when she was about to deliver news that might be unpleasant but was definitely necessary. "Mind if I sit down, honey?" she asked, already settling into the chair Uncle Frank had vacated. "We haven't had a chance to talk tonight." I was starting to wonder if you were actually going to stay for the whole party. There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't going to be the casual mother-daughter chat it appeared to be. Mom had spent 30 years managing family dynamics and social situations, and she had a sixth sense for when trouble was brewing, even when she couldn't identify the exact source. "I've been here the whole time," I said, gesturing toward my largely untouched dinner plate, just enjoying the celebration from a distance. "It's been quite a show." She followed my gaze toward the head table, where Dad was still holding court, with a group of longtime clients. Dave beside him like a loyal apprentice learning how to accept compliments gracefully. Amy was taking photos of every conversation, building what would undoubtedly become a scrapbook documenting Dave's coronation as the future of Martinez construction. "Your father's having the time of his life," Mom said, but there was something cautious in her voice. 25 years of building this business, and now he gets to see Dave ready to take it over. It's everything he dreamed of when he started out. I nodded, because what else was I supposed to do? Object to my father's happiness? Point out that his dreams had never included space for both of his children? Create a scene at his retirement party by pointing out the obvious favoritism that had shaped our family for 3 decades? Mom sipped her coffee and studied my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You've been awfully quiet tonight, Jessica. I know you and your father don't always see eye to eye, but I thought you'd be more excited about being here for such an important milestone." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on me. "You and your father don't always see eye to eye" was Mom's diplomatic way of acknowledging years of tension without actually taking sides or assigning blame. It was the kind of neutral language she'd perfected over the years, allowing her to navigate family conflicts without ever having to admit they existed. "I'm happy for Dad," I said, which was true enough. He built something solid, something that lasted. That's not easy to do in any business. But there was something else behind her question, some concern she wasn't expressing directly. Mom had always been good at reading undercurrents, at sensing when family harmony was more fragile than it appeared on the surface. Tonight felt different to her, and she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "The thing is," she continued, choosing her words carefully, "your father mentioned that you haven't been home for Christmas the last 2 years. And you missed Dave's promotion celebration last spring. People have been asking about you tonight, wondering how you're doing, what you're up to these days. People have been asking." Translation: the family was starting to look dysfunctional, and my absence was becoming noticeable enough to require explanation. In a community like Riverside, where everyone knew everyone else's business, having a daughter who never showed up for family events reflected poorly on the parents. "I've been busy with work," I said. "The property management business doesn't really shut down for holidays. People need maintenance and emergency repairs, regardless of what day it is." Mom nodded like that made perfect sense, but her expression suggested she was still processing something that didn't quite add up. Property management had always been a mystery to her, filed away in the same category as other jobs she didn't fully understand but assumed were respectable enough for a college-educated woman. "Of course, honey, it's just that sometimes I worry you're working too hard, spending too much time focused on other people's problems instead of building your own life. When I was your age, I was already married with a baby on the way. Not that there's anything wrong with having a career, but don't you want something more permanent? Something of your own?" Something of your own. The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud. Mom was worried that I wasn't building anything lasting, wasn't creating any real value in the world, wasn't following the Martinez family tradition of working toward ownership and independence. If she only knew how literally I'd taken those lessons. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Sarah Chen had moved away from her post by the side door and was walking purposefully toward our table, carrying a manila folder and wearing the kind of expression that suggested business rather than social chit-chat. Several people in the room recognized her, pointing her out to their companions with the kind of interest that comes when someone obviously important enters a social gathering. Mom turned to see what had caught my attention, and her eyes widened slightly when she recognized Sarah. "Oh my goodness, isn't that Sarah Chen, the real estate broker? What on earth is she doing here?" Sarah reached our table and smiled politely at Mom before turning to me with obvious familiarity. "Sorry to interrupt your family time, Jessica, but I wanted to catch you before the evening got too late. Do you have a few minutes to discuss?" The Henderson property situation? The Henderson property situation. The words landed like a small bomb in the middle of our conversation. Mom's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips as she processed what she'd just heard, trying to understand why a successful real estate broker would be consulting with her daughter about property matters. Of course, I said, standing up and taking the folder from Sarah. Mom, this is Sarah Chen. Sarah, this is my mother, Linda Martinez. Sarah extended her hand with the professional warmth she'd perfected over 15 years of closing deals and managing client relationships. Mrs. Martinez, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I've heard so much about your family over the years. Your daughter speaks very highly of all of you. Mom shook Sarah's hand automatically, but her expression remained confused. It's nice to meet you too, she said. I'm just surprised that you two know each other. Jessica never mentioned working with real estate agents. Sarah glanced at me with a look that asked whether she should explain or let me handle the introductions. I nodded slightly, and she continued with the kind of casual professionalism that made complex business relationships sound routine. Jessica and I have been working together for several years now, Mrs. Martinez. She's one of my most reliable clients, always very thorough in her property evaluations and investment decisions. Tonight we're finalizing the details on her latest acquisition. Latest acquisition. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just been blown out. Mom's mouth opened slightly, then closed again as she struggled to process information that didn't fit into any of her existing categories for understanding her daughter's life. I'm sorry, Mom said finally, her voice carefully controlled but obviously strained. I think there might be some confusion here. Jessica works in property management, not real estate investment. She manages apartments for other people. Sarah looked genuinely surprised, glancing between Mom and me like she was trying to understand how such a basic misunderstanding could exist within a family. Mrs. Martinez. Jessica owns 15 rental properties throughout Riverside County. She's been building her portfolio for almost 8 years now. Property management is just one aspect of her business. 15 rental properties. The number seemed to echo in the space around our table, growing louder with each repetition. Mom's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, something that might have been pride, and finally a kind of stunned recognition that she'd been operating with fundamentally incorrect information about her own daughter's career. 15 properties, Mom repeated slowly, like she was testing the words to see if they made sense when spoken aloud. You own 15 properties? The conversation at nearby tables had begun to quiet as people sensed drama unfolding. That peculiar shift in energy that happens when private family business threatens to become public entertainment. I could see Dad glancing in our direction, probably wondering why his wife was sitting with a real estate broker and looking like she'd just received shocking news. Actually, I said, deciding that if we were going to have this conversation, we might as well have it completely. It's 17 now. Sarah and I just closed on a small apartment complex in downtown Riverside last week. 24 units, fully occupied, excellent cash flow potential. Sarah nodded enthusiastically, clearly unaware that she was participating in what amounted to a family intervention. The downtown property was an excellent choice, Mrs. Martinez. Your daughter has a remarkable eye for undervalued assets. She spotted the potential in that building when 3 other investors had passed on it. Mom was staring at me like I'd just revealed that I was secretly a professional athlete or a famous musician, like the person sitting across from her was a complete stranger who happened to share her daughter's face. 17 properties, she said again. How is that even possible? How long has this been going on? About 8 years, I said. I started small, bought a duplex in Moreno Valley with money I'd saved from working property management jobs. Fixed it up, rented both units, used the income to qualify for a loan on the next property. Basic real estate investment strategy. But how did you afford the down payments? Mom asked. Property in California isn't cheap, and you couldn't have been making that much money managing other people's buildings. Sarah cleared her throat gently, recognizing that she'd stumbled into family territory that was more complicated than she'd realized. Mrs. Martinez, if you'll excuse me, I should probably let you two talk privately. Jessica, I'll email you the final documents for the Henderson acquisition. Congratulations again on another successful investment. She walked away quickly, leaving Mom and me alone with a stack of manila folders and a conversation that was about to reshape everything my family thought they knew about my life for the past decade. The Henderson acquisition. Mom seized on that phrase like it might provide some clarity in a situation that seemed to be growing more surreal by the minute. What's the Henderson acquisition? Are you buying the Henderson house? The one where your father renovated the kitchen? Not the house, I said. The entire block. 6 properties total, including the Henderson place. The family that owns them is retiring to Arizona and wanted to sell the whole portfolio at once. Sarah found the deal and brought it to me because she knew I'd been looking for opportunities in that neighborhood. Mom's eyes widened as the implications began to sink in. You're buying the entire block where you grew up playing? The block where your father worked on half the houses at some point or another? The irony wasn't lost on me either. While Dad had been building kitchens and bathrooms for other people, I'd been quietly acquiring the properties themselves, becoming the landlord for the very neighborhoods where Martinez Construction had built its reputation. Before Mom could ask another question, Dave appeared at our table with Amy in tow, both of them wearing expressions of curiosity mixed with concern. Dad was right behind them, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd noticed that his wife looked upset and was prepared to handle whatever crisis had developed. "Everything okay over here?" Dave asked, glancing between Mom's stunned expression and the real estate documents scattered across our table. "Mom looks like she's seen a ghost." Dad reached us just as Amy picked up one of the folders, scanning the cover page before her expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching shock. "Bob," she said slowly, "this is a property deed with Jessica's name on it." Dad took the folder from Amy and studied it carefully, his contractor's eye automatically cataloging details like square footage, lot dimensions, and assessed value. The Henderson property, he read aloud. 6 residential units, total purchase price $2.4 million. Buyer, Golden State Property Solutions. Golden State Property Solutions. My business name, the LLC I'd established 3 years ago, when my portfolio had grown large enough to require formal business structure. Dad's voice, when he said it, carried the same tone he might use to announce that aliens had just landed in the community center parking lot. "Jessica," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what is Golden State Property Solutions?" "It's my company," I said simply. "My real estate investment business. I incorporated 3 years ago when I hit 10 properties and needed better tax structures and liability protection." Dave was looking back and forth between the documents and my face like he was trying to solve a complex math problem. "You own a real estate company? Since when? And why didn't anyone know about this?" "Since I realized that managing other people's properties was good training for owning my own," I said. "And nobody knew because nobody ever asked. Every time I tried to talk about real estate at family dinners, you all explained to me why construction was more valuable than property ownership." Dad was still staring at the purchase agreement, probably calculating the kind of income that 17 rental properties would generate, the kind of net worth that buying multi-million-dollar property portfolios implied. $2.4 million, he said finally. "How do you have $2.4 million? "Good credit, solid income history, and equity from my other properties," I said. "Banks love lending money to people who own real estate that generates consistent rental income. It's considered very low risk compared to most business loans." Amy was flipping through another folder, her accounting background allowing her to understand the financial documents more quickly than the rest of my family. "Bob," she said, her voice tight with something that might have been disbelief or admiration, "these are profit and loss statements. She's showing net income of over $400,000 last year. Just from rental properties. $400,000. The number settled over our little family gathering like fog rolling in from the ocean, changing the visibility and making everything look different than it had just moments before. Dad slowly lowered himself into an empty chair, still holding the Henderson property documents like they might disappear if he set them down. $400,000, he repeated. That's more than Martinez Construction grosses in a good year. The community center had grown quieter around us as other guests began to leave, collecting their coats and saying their goodbyes after a successful evening of celebrating Bob Martinez's retirement. But our family was just getting started with a conversation that was 20 years overdue. Uncle Frank wandered over, probably drawn by the intense energy radiating from our table. "Everything all right over here?" he asked. "You all look like you're planning a hostile takeover or something." Dave laughed, but it came out hollow and slightly hysterical. "Turns out Jessica's been planning a hostile takeover for years, Frank. She just bought the entire Henderson block. Owns 17 properties. Makes more money than Dad's construction company." Frank blinked slowly, processing this information with the deliberate care of someone whose worldview was being challenged by unexpected data. 17 properties? Our little Jessica? The one who used to organize the office filing? "Not so little anymore," I said. "And the office filing turned out to be excellent training for managing real estate portfolios. I learned about cash flow and accounts receivable by watching how Dad's business operated." Mom had been quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined pride and regret, and a kind of wondering recognition. "All those times you said you were doing well in Los Angeles," she said. "All those times we asked how work was going and you said fine. You were building this the whole time." "I was trying to build something," I said. "Just like Dad taught me to. Find a need, work hard, treat people fairly, reinvest the profits. The same principles that made Martinez Construction successful." Dad was nodding slowly, his contractor's mind probably running calculations about property values and investment returns, and the kind of strategic thinking required to build a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio from scratch. 20 years, he said. "You've been doing this for 20 years, and we never knew." 8 years of serious investing, I corrected. "Before that, I was learning the business, saving money, building credit, studying markets. Same as you did before you started the construction company." Dave was staring at the profit and loss statements like they were written in a foreign language. $400,000 in net income, he said. From apartments, from collecting rent, from providing quality housing, maintaining properties, screening tenants, handling emergencies, managing contractors, dealing with city permits, solving problems, and building relationships, I corrected. Everything Dad taught me about customer service, just applied to a different industry. Amy had moved on to examining property photos. From my latest acquisitions, her voice growing more amazed with each image. "These aren't just apartments, Bob. This is a 40-unit complex in downtown Riverside. And this looks like commercial space. Jessica, do you own businesses too?" "Some of my properties have ground floor retail space," I said. "I leased a small business's restaurant, dry cleaner, insurance office. It provides additional income streams and helps stabilize the investment returns." The silence that followed was profound. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone is trying to recalibrate their understanding of reality. For 30 years, they'd operated under the assumption that Dave was the successful Martinez child, the one who'd inherited Dad's business acumen and work ethic. I was the daughter who'd moved away and chosen a safer, smaller path. Now they were discovering that while Dave had been learning to manage a construction crew, I'd been building an empire. Sarah Chen reappeared at our table, probably having noticed that our family conference was still in session. "I'm sorry to interrupt again, but Jessica, I wanted to confirm our meeting next Tuesday about the industrial property in Corona. The seller accepted your offer." "Industrial property," Dad said faintly. "You're buying industrial property now?" "It's a warehouse complex," I explained. "Good location near the freeway, solid tenant history, excellent cap rate. Sometimes you have to diversify beyond residential rentals." Sarah smiled apologetically. "I really should let you get back to your family celebration." "Jessica, congratulations again on another successful acquisition. You've built something remarkable here." After she left, Uncle Frank was the first to break the silence. "Well," he said, shaking his head slowly, "I guess we know which Martinez child really inherited the family business sense." Dad looked up at that, his expression shifting from shock to something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "You did learn," he said quietly. "Everything I tried to teach Dave about working hard and building something lasting. You were listening the whole time. I was listening," I said. "I just applied the lessons differently than you expected." Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm but slightly trembling. "Honey," she said, "why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were just managing other people's apartments when you were building all this?" Because every time I tried to talk about real estate, you told me it wasn't real work, I said. Every time I mentioned property investment, someone explained why construction was more valuable. After a while, I stopped trying to convince you and just focused on proving it to myself. Dave had been quiet during this exchange, studying the financial documents with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined respect and bewilderment, and maybe a little bit of fear. Jessica, he said, you make more money than our entire family business. You own more property than Dad ever built on. How long have you been ahead of us? About 5 years, I said. That's when my rental income first exceeded what Martinez Construction reported as annual revenue. But I kept growing while the construction business stayed roughly the same size. The community center was almost empty now, just a few staff members cleaning up, and our family cluster around a table covered with real estate documents that had rewritten 30 years of assumptions about success and failure, about who mattered and who didn't, about which Martinez child had really been paying attention to the family lessons about building something permanent. Dad stood up slowly, his movements careful, like someone who wasn't entirely sure of his balance. He walked around the table until he was standing beside my chair, then placed his hand on my shoulder with the kind of weight that comes from years of miscommunication, finally colliding with truth. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice rougher than I'd heard it all evening. A big one. I spent so much time teaching Dave how to follow in my footsteps that I never bothered to see where your own footsteps were leading. You don't need to apologize, Dad, I said. You taught me everything I needed to know. I just used it differently than you expected. He shook his head. I do need to apologize. For assuming construction was the only way to build something lasting. For treating your work like it didn't matter. For making you feel like you had to prove yourself instead of just supporting you from the beginning. Dave cleared his throat, his voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. Jess, he said, using the childhood nickname he'd abandoned years ago, I've been an ass. We all have. You built something incredible, and we were too stubborn to see it. Amy nodded vigorously, still clutching property photos like evidence in a trial. This is amazing, Jessica. You're like a real estate mogul. Why aren't you on the cover of business magazines or something? Because I don't need to be, I said. The properties speak for themselves. The tenants get quality housing, I get steady income, the communities get maintained neighborhoods. Everyone wins. Mom was still holding my hand, and I could feel her processing everything we'd learned in the past hour. 30 years of family dynamics were shifting around us like furniture being rearranged in a room that had stayed the same for too long. Frank was grinning now, the kind of smile that comes from watching long-held assumptions crumble in the most satisfying possible way. Bob, he said, you raised yourself a real entrepreneur. Someone who took your lessons and built something even bigger than what you started. Dad nodded slowly, his contractor's eye probably seeing my real estate portfolio as a different kind of construction project. One built with financing and relationships instead of lumber and nails. 17 properties, he said. That's not luck. That's vision and hard work and knowing how to spot opportunities. 20 years too late. But my father was finally seeing me clearly. The janitor was giving us pointed looks, suggesting that our family revelation needed to wrap up so he could finish cleaning the community center. We gathered the scattered documents and began the awkward process of figuring out what came next. How you rebuild family relationships after discovering that everything you thought you knew was wrong. As we walked toward the parking lot, Dave fell into step beside me. Jess, he said, I have to ask. Are you happy? I mean, really happy? All this success? All these properties? But are you satisfied with what you've built? I thought about the question as we reached my car, considering not just the financial aspects of my real estate business, but the deeper satisfaction that comes from creating something sustainable and valuable. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, I said. I'm financially independent. I provide housing for over 200 families. I've created a business that will continue generating value long after I'm gone. Yeah, Dave, I'm happy. He nodded, and for the first time in 30 years, I saw genuine respect in my brother's eyes when he looked at me. Dad appeared beside us, still carrying the Henderson property documents like a man who'd just discovered buried treasure in his own backyard. Jessica, he said, I know it's probably too late to ask this, but would you be interested in having dinner next weekend? Just family. No retirement parties, no business talk unless you want to. Just us figuring out how to be a family that actually knows each other. I looked around at my parents, my brother, my sister-in-law, all of them seeing me clearly for the first time in decades. It wasn't everything I'd wanted growing up, but it was something I'd never expected to have as an adult. The possibility of family relationships built on truth instead of assumptions. "I'd love that, Dad," I said. "Maybe I can finally explain what I've been doing with my life for the past 20 years. He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way that reminded me of childhood mornings, when he'd ruffle my hair and tell me I was smart enough to do anything I wanted. "I think," he said, "we'd all like to hear that story." As I drove back toward Los Angeles that night, I thought about the difference between being seen and being understood, between proving yourself and being valued for who you already are. I'd spent 20 years building something remarkable, but tonight was the first time my family had bothered to notice. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't solve decades of misunderstanding overnight, but it was a beginning, the foundation for something that might eventually become what we should have been all along. A family that recognized success in all its forms, that celebrated achievement wherever it appeared, that understood the difference between following in someone's footsteps and finding your own path to the same destination. 3 months later, I bought my 18th property, a small office building 2 blocks from Martinez Construction. Dave called to congratulate me before anyone else in the family, and for the first time in our lives, his pride in my success felt completely genuine. That evening, Dad stopped by the property to see what his daughter had bought this time. As we stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building that would soon house 3 small businesses and generate another stream of rental income, he shook his head in amazement. "You know what the best part is?" he said. "You did it the Martinez way, hard work, fair dealing, building something that lasts. You just did it bigger than any of us imagined possible." For 30 years, I'd been trying to earn my father's respect by proving I could succeed outside the family business. I'd never realized that what I was really doing was taking everything he'd taught me and using it to build something even more ambitious than what he'd accomplished. I'd become exactly what he'd always wanted his children to become. I'd just done it in a way he'd never thought to imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.